Long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a Doof Media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series and beyond. I am your host, Constant Reader Scott Daly, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host. He's hanging from a ladder, waiting for me to tell him to let go. It's Matt Freeman. How's it going today, Matt?
Is it ready yet?
You know, when I wrote this intro, it didn't occur to me how fucking dark that story is, and maybe I shouldn't make a funny intro joke to start the show off with the right energy.
I mean, that's our whole thing, though, is we're covering this incredibly dark material often. You gotta make a totally inappropriate and tone breaking joke about it.
Totally fair. This week on the show, we are reaching the end of our coverage of Stephen King's Night Shift. We have 4 more stories we're going to be talking about this week. Children of the Corn, The Last Rung on the Ladder, The Man Who Loved Flowers, and The Woman in the Room. Man, a lot of the preposition going on here.
Yeah, you're right. Good point. Interesting.
Man, what a fascinating collection of stories to end this whole thing on, Matt. This episode, I think, is going to be a little bit different from our normal ones, and I think that's okay because I think us doing short stories was us kind of exploring the format of our show a little bit and exploring what we do a little bit here. And honestly, the final 3 stories we cover, those last 3, we're not going to do a beat by beat analysis of it. I think we're going to have just a much more free flowing, loose conversation about them. For many reasons, and I think we'll get into those reasons as we discuss them, but just an interesting little collection of stories here that I actually love quite a bit. I really like all these stories.
Yeah, me too. Yet again, every week continues to be radically different from the last, and the stories within each batch are surprising. I'm actually looking forward to the overview episode we're going to do next week, simply because it gives me the chance to think back over all of the stories that we've talked about, this whole month, and kind of draw some connections that I haven't necessarily made as we've been going through Nose to the Grindstone.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one thing that is interesting about a short story collection is, like a mixtape, it's a person or persons choosing which stories and in which order they're going to be presented to us. So we haven't really talked about that too much so far. I think that is an opportunity in the overview episode to kind of look over the table of contents of these stories and say, hey, why do we think we did them in this order? And, stuff like that.
Yeah, good point.
Awesome. All right, we will get right into it. But before we do it, Matt, I have to issue a correction and an apology. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to set a little scene for you. Okay. Just go in your mind's eye, picture it. It's 8:00 in the morning on a Thursday. You have just dropped your son off at daycare, and are walking, still in the daycare facility, walking your way out. Okay. The daycare, by the way, is in a Christian academy and / church that the daycare rents space from in order to operate. And you pull out your phone because you're walking back to your car. You're not really paying attention to anything. You've dropped off your kid. You open up your email, and a listener sent us in an email. And you open it up, and it's boobies. there's boobies on your email. I have never closed my phone as fast as I did last Thursday morning when a listener sent us an example of a issue of the Cavalier magazine, one of the ones that King actually wrote one of these stories in, just to prove the point that I was wrong when I said last week that Cavalier magazine is not a nudie mag. It most certainly is. I was wrong, and now I know that for sure. So all right. Just wanted to issue that correction and apologize to, I don't know, a God, I guess. Yeah. Sorry about looking at boobs in a church.
And thank our reader for providing us with the physical evidence, without which we never would have believed it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the dedication. No, I think, I don't know all these magazines. I mean, I know like today we have one from Penthouse. That's a magazine I know, not intimately, but I know of. I'm going to change the subject. Let's talk about this story.
All right.
All right, let's get into Children of the Corn. This story was originally published in the March 1977 edition of Penthouse. And this is, an interesting story in the context of Stephen King and in the context of these 4 stories in particular, because it's the longest, or one of the longest in the collection, and I think the one that you and the general population are probably the most familiar with out of this book collection, because you watched that original Children of the Corn movie a couple years ago for Other Levels of the Tower, and also there's been like 1,000 sequels to that movie for whatever reason. So this is like the most well-known Night Shift story, I think it's safe to say.
A couple years ago.
Yeah, Matt.
Jesus.
It's called time, Matt.
All
it
right.
moves.
I'll take your word for it. Anyway, yeah, that's true. We did watch the movie, and I think even when we talked about it for that podcast, you mentioned that it was much more a story about them having a horrible marriage,
yeah,
than it was necessarily a sort of supernatural thriller, which is kind of what the movie turns into. Although those elements are all in this. I mean, it's in some regards, it's a straightforward adaptation, except that the story is simply much shorter and more straightforward than the movie. So, this is another cool premise, right? Like it's the kind of premise where you see why they made a bunch of sequels, because it's like creepy idea. It's just an inherently creepy idea.
No, totally. So our story begins with our two characters, Bert and Vicky, driving down a Nebraska farm road, and they're arguing. And that is, as you said, really what this story is actually really about. Bert and Vicky and their failing marriage, and how much these two characters actually just freaking hate each other. They like so much. I would say this is 95% a story about two people that hate each other in a marriage, and like 5% a story about creepy murdered children and a demon corn monster.
Yes, absolutely correct. That is the psychological focus of the story, and I mean, I think it becomes really interesting by the end. And it's a short enough story. There's no reason to stand on ceremony. I can just talk about the thing that I think is interesting is that yes, they hate each other. Yes, he's extremely resentful of her, but by the end of the story, once the situation has become dire, he's not so inhuman that he's incapable of feeling like horror and loss at the idea that she's going to get stolen and murdered by these children. Like, and then when she's killed, he's devastated by it, right? So it's interesting because it juxtaposes what you're pointing out, which is very much like about as bad as a marriage can get without officially being over, and then realizing, well, like, that doesn't mean I want her to be dead, you know. So I think that's an interesting emotional kind of point in emotional space that the book is nailing.
No, that's a really good point, because one of the things I think the story emphasizes is not the physical violence that Bert does to Vicky, because he never actually, attacks her in any way, but like he constantly wants to, right? Like one of the opening lines of the story here is he was gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. He decided he was holding on to it tightly because if he loosened it up, why, one of those hands might just fly off and hit the ex-prom queen besides him right in the chops. And that continues throughout the story. There's that one, I think, really impactful moment where he screams at her about the body they have in their trunk and sees her flinch and takes like a really sick kind of pleasure out of seeing the fact that he just scared her and she had a physical reaction to what he was doing. And there is that really interesting juxtaposition between that kind of desire for physical violence against a person to having to witness actual physical violence done against them, which really messes him up, and especially since there's all these ideas that this is his fault, that the reason he continues to go down this path of exploring this town and not leaving is not because he really wants to do it, but because he has to prove that he was right and she was wrong. And he can't, like, even when he figures out things are really bad here, he's like, well, I can't leave yet, because then I'll have to admit that she knew more than I did. And so there's a lot of really interesting stuff here for sure.
Yeah. No, I totally. That's a great thread to pull on, because the whole story, in a sense, is this ode to pigheadedness. Because he's driving down this road despite the fact that he doesn't really know where he is, and then and she's criticizing him, and he's just kind of doubling down on his decision. And then they get to the town, and it's just repeatedly him making decisions where it's a questionable decision, and maybe if everything were going right, he would be willing to, admit that it was a questionable decision, but because of his, feeling of his ego being threatened and the fact that, like, in contention with his wife, he has to just double down on his stupid decision that even he didn't particularly think was necessarily the right thing, and then it gets everybody killed. So yeah.
I want to phrase this, and I don't know how to quite do this, but there is something that I was really trying to pick at with this story, which is this idea that you have this married couple and then you have children on the other side, right? And this idea, I don't even know if I have a fully formed thought here, but this idea of kind of King exploring what children do to a marriage or could possibly do to a marriage. I don't know. Do you think there's anything there? Because obviously there was a choice here to make them children. And I don't think the choice is just, because kids can be really creepy and that's fun. I think there is, because so much of this story is about the relationship between these two people. I just feel like there's something here exploring, what a marriage is and what children can and cannot bring to a marriage. I don't know. Am I off base?
Well, I don't want to say you're off base because I love the idea of it, but I don't have much more to say beyond what you just said. Like, yeah, you have a horrible marriage, you introduce children, and it's just going to make things worse for that horrible marriage. I think, and then, literalizing that perhaps by saying, the children just pull you out of your car and stab you.
Yeah, that is, we have one child with another on the way. And I think that's an accurate representation of having kids, just they pull you out of the car and they stab you a whole lot. And then they sacrifice you to the corn gods. That's exactly what my experience has been so far.
Yeah, the corn god is a big part of parenting.
Oh, we got to talk about this corn demon. That is, we'll get to it, but that is one of the more fascinating choices in the story to me, actually.
Sure.
So I just want to say here at the beginning that it was told to us in the story that part of the reason why they're driving across the country is as a way of a last-ditch effort to fix their marriage. And I got to say, I found the problem in the marriage there. These two people are idiots. Because if anyone, there's no way being stuck in a car with people for an extended amount of time is going to fix anything.
You don't think that it's just talking about your problems for another 8 hours is going to fix them, Scott?
No, especially in a situation where when you get mad at the other person, there's nowhere you can go. You can just turn towards the window, which is always going to work really, really great. It's a great plan. Really great plan, Bert.
But that means you can't. That means you have to, resolve the problems through conversation.
Yeah,
because
that's definitely
you can't end so the conversation just keeps going all day, and then eventually you're going to resolve it. That's how conversations work, especially between people who are communicating poorly.
What I love about you is your just innate understanding of people and how they work.
Yeah, I'm a psychologist, actually.
No, it's a terrible idea. And of course, their marriage would have been doomed whether or not they got eaten by Corn Man.
Yeah, you could view this as a kind of blessing, really.
Sure. There's the silver lining to end all silver linings. What happens to Bert and Vicky is actually a blessing.
Yeah.
So their wonderful, pleasant cruise is interrupted by Bert running over a child. Bert is, of course, horrified because he's just committed manslaughter, but it's okay, Matt. We don't have to feel too bad about this because we learned very quickly that the child's throat was slit before he was tossed out of the corn and onto the road. So he didn't kill him. We're fine. We're totally fine.
What a way to begin a story, man. Like, it's not, pretty short span of pages, sentences, really, from establishing characters. Okay, they're man and wife, they hate each other. Bam, we ran over a kid in the street. Holy shit, this is a horrible situation. And we're not even like to the actual premise yet. It hits very hard and very fast. And it definitely leaves an impression.
Do you think like this is like a reverse Save the Cat situation? Run over the child is like a...
I mean, definitely you don't like Bert and you don't care about him. And after he runs
Yeah.
over a child and seems to feel very little emotion about it, beyond, I mean, he doesn't feel no emotion about it, but he feels what strikes me as an inadequate level of horror and grief over this.
Yeah.
It does make, it's interesting because I don't think Bert's not the worst.
No.
We've said similar things about other characters in this book of short stories, is that like, yeah, they suck, but they suck in a way where they're relatable and human. And I think that's Bert again.
No, I agree. I mean, I think it is very easy to sit here and judge a character for like one of the first thing he does when reacting to running over a child is like thinking about the legal repercussions for this act, like what it's going to do to him. But I also think that's a very relatable human thing to do too, right? Sometimes your brain can't help but think those things.
I guess I feel like that wouldn't be the first thing that I thought of, but
probably not me either. I was just trying to be as charitable as possible to this guy.
I mean, yeah, you're not wrong. Yeah.
So Matt, the big thing I want to talk to you about Children of the Corn is how King kind of handles the slow reveal of what is happening in this small Nebraska town. I don't know if you remember our conversation on the movie, but this was my big major problem with the film, actually. And I talked about this knowing that the book does it differently, and in my opinion better, is that the film opens with the scene of the kids kind of collectively deciding to murder all their parents and all the adults in the town and take over. So we see from the first second of the movie what's going on in Gatlin, and this story is really barely any children in the corn, right? It's mostly the slow roll lead up to figuring out what happened here. And I don't know, I just think this is so much better, like so much better.
Yeah, I mean, part of me wishes that I could have read this sort of having no idea where we were heading, but
I thought of that and I was like, oh man, I kind of specifically robbed him of that experience by having him watch the movie first.
Well, I mean, I don't think it was you who robbed me of it, because I think that the cultural knowledge of what the Children of the Corn is too prevalent for me to have avoided anyway.
Okay.
But yeah, like the fun is in the dread and the tension of like what is going on. Like it's a well done mystery as you're going in, and especially because you're following Bert, who's pigheadedly refusing to acknowledge that anything is weird, while his wife is pointing out all these things that are obviously weird. Which, by the way, is like a great mechanism for conveying information in a more show don't tell way. I mean, there is a lot of like Bert looking at things and registering them, but a lot of it is like his wife pointing things out and verbalizing them, and then him arguing that it doesn't matter or she's being paranoid, etc. So it makes it more of like it makes it way more dynamic and interesting than if it were just like, for example, Bert by himself driving into this town thinking these things in his head.
No, you're so right. The thing I'm thinking of specifically is when they go into the diner together, and like clearly no one's been in this diner in like 5 years, and Bert is like refusing to see that, and then Vicky points to the calendar and notes that the year is like 1966 or something, several years ago. And yeah, I think that's such a better way to convey information than just. And then Bert looked at the calendar and noticed it was 6 years out of date. You know, it's dramatic. It moves, and also it continues the plot of what the story is, which is actually the relationship between these two people.
Yeah, it's more memorable too. Yeah. You know, it's a more memorable moment than just like a sentence registering the information.
Yeah. There is another kind of Kingism that the story really focuses around, and that is religion. And that's something I wanted to talk to you about here too, because, you know, one of the things we see as they drive into Gatlin, they start hearing and seeing these signs of religious fervor and also specifically, you know, around children, which of course we've learned that they're literal children, but they at one point turn to a radio station and hear a young child giving a sermon, and they have this conversation. And I thought this would be a great jumping off point to talk about this whole thing. So Bert says, didn't you think he sounded kind of young, that preacher? She uttered a mirthless laugh. A teenager, maybe. So what? That's what's so monstrous about that whole trip. They like to get a hold of them when their minds are still rubber. They know how to put all the emotional checks and balances in. So this is a story not just about religion, but about like the ways in which religion can manipulate, and specifically manipulate children. And I don't know, I found this a really interesting kind of, it's not the primary focus of the story, but it's definitely there, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, the fact that they formed this cult is front and center, and it's very religious, very Christian tinge specifically.
Mm-hmm.
I really did want to talk about this because like the two main characters are crafted in a way that really emphasizes the Christian element here, because like she strikes me as a character who had a religious upbringing and then broke away from it and is rejecting it, and you know, maybe she has some religious trauma. And then Bert, for his part, he doesn't kind of come out swinging the way that she does, but it's obvious that he has some history with it because his perspective is just tinged by knowledge of Christian iconography and dogma, and like just the fact that he goes into the church and he like knows what a knave is is the kind of thing. It's just like a tell. And then as he's going through the Bible, like he knows what should be there and what shouldn't be there, right? Like so clearly he's a guy who knows Christianity, who knows religion. And that's never lampshaded, it's never shoved in our face, but it just is the subtext of his character. And I guess both of the protagonist characters, both of the characters have obvious history with religion that comes into play in a very meaningful way in the story, and I think that's interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, typically, and what I think Vicky kind of decides is happening here is this idea of, you know, adults using religion as a way to manipulate children, right? But I think it's interesting that in the context of this story, that's not actually what's happening, right? I mean, there are no adults in this story. There is a corn monster, which is another really interesting angle on this whole thing, which is that these kids, you know, formed this religious cult and murdered all adults in the place and took over and established this very strict dogma that requires all 19-year-olds and older to sacrifice themselves and die. And there's a way of looking at that and going, wow, this shit is crazy. But then also in the world of the story, it's all real. Everything is 100% actually real. The corn is magical and powerful. There's a magical demon corn monster that eats people and is actually making demands. It's all real, actually.
Yeah. That is, I mean, so the question that you're not asking, but that I guess I'm asking is, would it have been better if there hadn't been a real corn demon and if it were just a horror story about, you know, the idea that out there in the far, far away, distant parts of Americana that are disconnected little enclaves of humanity, weird ideas can get into people's heads, and maybe one day all the kids murder all their parents and they establish this weird cult, and there's kind of no reason for it. It's just, you know, it's just people being weird. Weirder things have happened, and it's like, would that have been better than like, no, it's actually a corn demon. It's a corn demon.
Yeah, no, I don't think better. I do think it's interesting that like we could have, when I'm trying to like wrap my head around kind of the point or what the story is trying to say, it just strikes me as a choice that was definitely made, that changes things a little bit, because it I guess it's one thing to like comment on religion and religious dogma and the manipulative, powerful forces it can have on people, while sitting from a perspective of, and it's all bullshit, right? Like it's saying, and everything's fake, it's all bullshit, and look how powerful this thing is, even though it's bullshit. It is another thing entirely to say, look at this incredibly manipulative, powerful force that also has real power in this world as well. I don't know. It does change it a little bit.
Yeah, I guess I'm not going to come down too hard either way. I don't really mind there being a corn demon.
Yeah, no, I think the corn demon's fun because it does also draw this really fun view of the world that I think is very in line with Stephen King, is that there are just pockets and areas in this world that we just don't understand, that have powers beyond what we understand. And we can use those as metaphors, like we really love to do, right? Like, the corn demon is representative of the powerful force of belief and religion on people, especially susceptible people. It can be real and also be metaphor at the same time.
Sure, it can even be a specific metaphor for the idea of the corn, the corn demon, the corn nature of the corn demon symbolizing the isolation and remoteness.
Yeah,
because the corn is yes, it is a real element, but it is also a metaphor for isolation. It is this endless sea of distance, of non-human distance that you can get lost in. So
it's also just kind of representative of Americana in a way, right? Like the corn fields of the Midwest, it seems to me just like intensely specifically American. And I wonder if there's a commentary here then on, like, these children establish this horrible, like, overthrow their parents and establish this horrible religion, but like the only adults, the only quote unquote parents we have an example of in the story are Bert and Vicky, who both kind of suck. And like you can imagine these two people, if we want to use the children of the corn as a metaphor for having children to save your marriage, then like it becomes a really interesting commentary on, like, if these are the type of people having children to save their marriage, no wonder their children are overthrowing them, murdering them, and beginning to worship corn demons, right?
Yeah, sure. I do like that as an extension of your idea from earlier.
All right, so we kind of been jumping all around, but they get into town. They don't find anything. They go through that the municipal building and through the diner and see everything's empty. And then they see, as you pointed out, they see the church, which is the only building in the whole place that has been kind of meticulously, wonderfully kept, which is a delicious detail. Like, you can imagine the first read of this and like that being like perking up your interest to like, oh, the church, interesting. One of the choices that King makes here that I find really interesting, Matt, is we basically learn what happens in Gatlin through Bert reading the book he finds on the pulpit next to the Bible and kind of just making an educated guess about what actually happened here. And I love when King does this, because like he has a way of writing moments like this where you just kind of accept that the character's angle on what happened here is just an accurate depiction of what happened there. Like, there's no moment of doubt or questioning. You're like, oh, maybe Bert's wrong about this or something else, like you just kind of buy into it. And I don't know, I think King has done this before. I think we've talked about this before in The Dark Tower, where, there's moments in these books where the narrator can and can't be more reliable. But I feel like when King wants to convey information in this manner, he does it in a way that you always just say, yep, okay, that's what happened. This is what King is telling us through Bert, and this is what happened here.
Yeah, I think that was somewhat also in Jerusalem's Lot.
Yeah.
In fact, a very similar moment involving a pulpit.
Yeah, no, you're right.
But it's I agree. I think it's a good technique. I think he uses it in a way that's effective here, because you kind of feel like it's almost a story within a story, because Bert's sort of relating to you the story of what happened, and then you're sort of imagining that along with him, which is a technique that we've remarked that King likes to use and uses very effectively.
Yeah. So as he's pondering what to do next, Vicky starts laying on the horn, and Bert rushes outside to find their cart absolutely surrounded by kids. They attack, dragging Vicky out and stabbing Bert in the process. He just takes off running. He takes off running across the town and into the corn. And the corn makes him feel good, Matt. This is when we learn that the corn is indeed magical, because it makes him feel more alive.
Yeah.
And powerful.
Okay. Might as well. Sure.
Can we return to our ongoing question on, does Stephen King have a thing about corn?
God, I'm so glad you said that, Scott. because in this particular story, the corn is bad. But they're
like in a sexy way.
Maybe. I mean, because it does make him feel powerful and strong, right? Which, so I feel like King has always thought of, I don't know, corn, I think that to him, corn is almost a double, like a big cornfield. It is both like kind of creepy because it's this vast uniform mass of stuff that you could get lost in or something could be hiding in, and that thing could be bad, but also it's this like giant ocean of like plenty and nourishment. Yeah. And it's gonna feed so many people, and there's something incredibly wholesome about it too, because it's like somebody grew this. This is a living thing that was grown, and it's going to be used to feed people. So it's like, I think that's what makes it maybe kind of a symbol that he keeps coming back to, is that it has this intrinsic dual nature to it. Like you can imagine looking at a field of corn, and you can sort of imagine feeling the way Mother Abigail feels, where it's like magical and beautiful and almost like sexual in its like abundance that's just flowing forth from it. But then also you can look at it and as if you are the preacher in Signs, and something's in there. What just moved the swing set and then ran off into the corn? I don't know. So yeah, I don't know. I think this is definitely the most corn bad of King's stories. So I don't know. Does any of that sound right to you?
Yeah, I think it does. I'm glad we had a very serious conversation about Stephen King's sexual attraction to corn.
Yeah,
but no, I think you're right. I mean, obviously there is something both terrifying and mysterious and wonderful about like a giant fucking field of plant that is so tall that you could get lost in it. I think it's really, really cool. I love the image of a lot of this stuff. So no, I agree.
Yeah, me too.
So eventually Bert bursts into a clearing and sees Vicky corn-cified? Corn crucified? Whatever. She's up on a cross and got corn husks in her eyes, and it's fucking gross and kind of awesome, actually.
Yeah, it's kind of metal album cover worthy.
Yeah. And then the corn demon comes out and eats him. Something
turns him into corn, probably.
Sure. And this is the moment the story with our two main characters dead, the story shifts to the children. And this is like the first time we get to see the children. And this is, Matt, I think the one time that we see like Malachi and some of the names from the movie that were such, important parts in the movie. Is really the one time we get to actually see these kids. But we see here that as punishment, he who walks behind the rose has announced that the legal age of survival has been lowered from 19 to 18. And so all 19-year-olds must walk out into the corn. I really thought long and hard about what's the metaphor here, like the idea that I don't know. I can't even begin to think about what this is. And I'm hoping you have a great idea, because like, what is the idea that like, because I think there's a feeling that the end of the story gives you that this is just going to keep happening, right? Like it starts at 19 and then it moves down to 18 and then eventually 17, 16, it's going to shrink. Is this just a big giant metaphor for the infantilization of children?
I don't know. I feel like that's not what I was thinking, but maybe I was thinking it has more to do with like the corn is asking more and more and more of the people who tend it. It's so I don't know. I don't know, man. You asked me to spitball, so I'm going to spitball. But like, we harvest the corn, and this is kind of a fun horror concept because it's flipping the script, and now the corn is sort of harvesting us. The corn has harvested all of the adults, and now you adult, now you're all in service to the corn, right? You're in service to the corn. And okay, that wasn't good enough service. Now we're going to harvest the 18-year-olds. It's just I can't think of any specific textual evidence for that being true, other than just the idea that I can't believe that a bunch of kids basically would be actually planting this corn. Like this seems like just straight up magic corn that grows itself and sustains itself. And so it's like the Corn doesn't even really need them for anything except like their life energy. So now, like, so the Corn is eating them in the way that we, that humans typically eat the Corn.
I think I've cracked it, Matt.
Okay,
Here we go. You ready? You
yeah.
ready?
Mm-hmm.
This is a story about how agrarian society murders childhood, and so over time, the definition of childhood, when childhood ends and adulthood begins, is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller because society demands younger and younger children to assume adult-like responsibilities.
Yep, you've done it. That's it.
It's got to be. It's the only plausible explanation.
Sure, I like that better than whatever I was saying.
I don't actually believe it's it at all, but it fits, and therefore it's like when you're doing a puzzle and like it's definitely not the right piece, but it fits in the spot, and so you're like, all right, we did it.
I do wonder how most of these books / stories of kings are written. Like, does he like? I think I'm almost certain that he starts with like the premise or the vibe or the feeling or the idea, and then definitely comes back through later and is like, what's the metaphor? Like, what's the theme? Because even like he knows how how theme works. He knows that you don't even necessarily know what the theme of your story is until you've written the first draft, and then it jumps out at you.
Yeah.
So I guess I just answered my own question. I think that's probably what happened with this one, is to the degree that there is a metaphor in it, I think it probably was not the first thing he thought of.
Yeah, but I wonder how much that is true in the case of short stories, because I know we know that's true in his process for writing novels, certainly. But I do wonder, like, how much time post novel or post short story is done, doing that second pass to tighten it up and kind of identify the themes that were inadvertently there and cement them a little bit more. I don't know. I don't actually know the answer to that.
Yeah, I don't know either. Yeah, it's interesting.
I do think it's funny because this is one of those stories that to me feels like this was perhaps an idea he had that he didn't necessarily think was going to be a short story. And then he just started writing it. And at some point the idea just kind of petered out a little bit. And he's like, oh, there's not much more to do here. But if I wrap this up here, then I can just call it a short story and be done.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds about right. Because you could imagine a version of it that's more like the movie, like more expansive. You meet all these individual kids in the town. You learn more about the town's history. There's more twists and turns. There's like kids who are hiding out, and then the adults find them. And yeah, like you could totally imagine it being a novel. But I think no way to know whether you're right or wrong. But it does feel like maybe he kind of was like, yeah, this is about all that I can squeeze out of this idea.
Mm-hmm. All right. Anything else you wanted to say about Children of the Corn before we move on?
No, I'm good.
Do you know there was a new movie released this year? A new adaptation of this story?
Certainly did not know that. No.
It is supposed to be pretty bad. I think we'll probably have to visit it at some point for other levels of the tower. But
wonderful.
All right, let's move on to our second story, The Last Rung on the Ladder. This one is one of the 3 or 4 stories in this collection that had never been published before. And Matt, we're going to have to like change the tenor of our conversation here, which is one of the really interesting things about doing these short story collections, because this is a very, very dour, sad story. And it's to me, the one that I thought of most when I think about Night Shift. When I look back on my experience reading this book for the first time, with the stories that really stuck out to me, The Last Rung on the Ladder was one of them. And it's the one I like, even when we got that question a month ago from a listener asking which of the stories I was most excited to cover, this is the one that popped into my head first.
Yeah, I can see why. It's definitely leaves you with a very powerful emotional feeling.
Yeah, and the writing is so interesting. I've been thinking of like a way to describe this kind of story, right? And I'm not sure I know how, but I feel like there's a thing that King can sometimes do where he like shifts into another gear in his writing, like he sits down and is like, oh, this one's important, or this one's bigger, And suddenly he's talking in a voice that is, recognizably Stephen King, but is also like more literary, in a way, but just a bigger, more important, more like recognizing the drama of what he's about to write. I don't know. Do you think agree with me on any of this here?
Well, yeah. I mean, this reminds me of the voice that he uses in his more serious and more literary works, which we've read a few of these, and I my favorite, Flowman and Yellow Coats, and really the entirety of Hearts in Atlantis, I feel is written more in this prose style, in this prose voice that he's using. And I think it's at least somewhat conscious, because when he's writing something like Children of the Corn, he's trying to write entertaining pulp. Like it's the kind of story that he's trying to write. That's the appropriate writing style for that kind of story. If he wrote Children of the Corn using this slow, thoughtful voice, it would feel weird, and it would actually be bad, unless he changed that story, because it just wouldn't fit. So yeah, I mean, definitely he has at least a couple of different voices that he used.
Yeah,
you know what I mean when I say voice, like yeah. He definitely has at least, sort of the sitting on the bar stool next to you going, okay, I got some really fucked up to tell you. This is you're gonna love this. And then he's got like morosely telling you some sad thing that happened,
Yeah. And maybe, that's part of the reason why this story was never published before, because, when you're thinking about like Penthouse and Cavalier, that this is not the type of story you think, you'd want to be flipping through, looking at boobs, and then, a story, I'll read this. Jesus Christ. And I think he's definitely an author that writes to his audience too. Like, you're absolutely right. Children of the Corn is a story written for someone reading Penthouse magazine. So it's going to have the tone and the voice that matches the type of thing you'd want, which is like this fun kind of loose, gross tone to it. This is this feels like, I don't know, this feels like one written for me, and by me I mean him, Stephen King. He did not write this for me, Scott Daly. And I think this is not the last time I'm going to say this week. Actually, I think there's another story that we're going to talk about in a bit that feels like that to me as well. And it's really interesting because this story really fucks you up. It really does. I mean, what was your kind of take on this? What was your experience reading the story like?
Well, I think from close to the start, I knew where things were headed, based on a combination of the tone, and I think he throws in enough sort of hints and indicators of like what kind of story you're in. So it wasn't really the kind of like dread that I associate with horror, but it was a different kind of dread where it's like, I just really don't want this to go where I know it's going. And it's interesting because I was actually pretty sure that the girl would be fine in the barn, and it's interesting the way he structures it, because you don't know. Okay, something bad happens to her in the barn. How is that related to what's going to happen in the present of the guy telling the story?
Yeah,
is it going to be that something horrible happened to her and it led her into a life where now she is in a much worse place? You're not sure. But you're curious because you're like, okay, well, I want to know how things got to the situation that they're at now, and I really like that it is a very subtle and like even sadder idea that like the way that this story really connects to the present is that she kind of tried to reach out to him using this story as sort of a reference, and he just missed it, and that gives him even more of a feeling of loss and emptiness.
Yeah. And as we said before, I don't want to do our like typical beat by beat movement through this story in particular,
Mhm.
because it just feels weird to like talk about the beats of this. I kind of want to. This is a very short story. It's less than 10 pages, and it's kind of a vibe type story. So I
Yeah.
think it's better if we just talk about what we think the story is saying and what it's doing, than go through the moments beat by beat. But I think for people that maybe haven't reread the story in a while and just want a quick summary of what the hell we're talking about here, in essence, the story is about a man whose sister kills herself, and he's reminiscing about a time when they were playing in the barn, climbing a ladder and then jumping off of a beam into a corn. Or not corn. I got corn on the brain.
Oh my God.
Into a
Hey,
haymow,
hey, yeah.
and the ladder breaks and she almost falls, but he is able to save her by moving the hay from one place to the other quickly enough to where she only breaks a leg. But it's about that event, and I think that event is really obviously a very important moment in both of their lives. But it's also about siblings. It's also about the relationship you have with your sibling, and the way that relationship changes as you grow older and get on with your life. Like I think when you're a child living in a house, your sibling is one of your closest companions, and that changes over time. It does. I think we both have siblings. You have a brother. I have two sisters, and honestly, I'm jealous of your relationship with your brother at times, because I think you have a really solid relationship with your brother. Where if your brother was having a hard time and was trying to reach out to you, I think you would be there right away, immediately.
Yeah, I mean, just to maybe put a necessary context on that, like he came to college when I was in graduate school, so we spent we were almost, I mean, we were literally roommates in college, in addition to having been brothers for our whole childhood. So there's a reason for that, right? But just to anyway.
Yeah, and I'm not saying I have like a bad relationship with my siblings. I think we're in a pretty good place right now, but we're not like super close. Like we see each other a fair amount of times. We talk a fair amount of times, but we definitely don't have. I mean, I would say I would like to have a better relationship with them than I do. Not that I'm actively doing anything about that right now, but I think that's part of it, right? Is life gets in the way. I think that's the tragedy of this guy. Is his sister was really important to her, and he saw him as he saw himself as her older brother and protector, and she saw that too. Like I love the moment in this where she's hanging from the ladder. He tells her to let go. She just does it. And he only realizes later that she never looked down and she had no idea what he was doing down there. And she let go when he said to let go, not because she knew she would be okay or she knew he had moved stuff, but just because he trusted her and knew that he would be there. Mm-hmm. And the line here is, I knew you must have been doing something to fix it. You're my big brother. I knew you'd take care of me. And the way that changes when you move into adulthood and life kind of gets in the way. And I don't think our narrator is like a bad person. He just got busy with his own life,
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting how, what I don't think there's like a correct, solid, eternal answer to the question of like, what do you owe to your siblings? Mm-hmm. What do you owe to your family? What do you owe to your cousins, for that matter? Like, it's interesting to me that society really hasn't given us much of a script here. There's sort of a gesture in the direction of like, oh, well, it's your sister. It's like, okay, well, what does that mean exactly? Does that mean I need to drop everything if my sister needs me? Does that mean like where does that fall in the priority ranking? And the fact is, it's really an individual choice. Everybody's relationship with their siblings is different, and and it's very hard, as you say, to be like, I'm going to sort of prioritize this more than I feel like doing, or just maybe more than is convenient, more than is easy, and the world doesn't really cooperate with you on that, especially if you don't live anywhere near your sibling. It becomes even harder. It's the same reason we lose contact with friends too. You just like you can have a really, really close friend, and it's just like, okay, unless you're going to put in a constant source of inconvenient effort, that friendship is going to diminish from what it was.
And I mean, it's a type of thing where when a tragedy like a suicide happens, like it's very easy to look back and be like, oh, these were all the individual moments where the person was reaching out, pleading for help, and I just didn't see it, right?
Mhm.
And like you can look at the moments through this where like she's writing to him and it's like, oh, by the way, I've been having kind of a tough time. Can you come out? And he says, oh, I really can't right now. And like obviously, if you knew the person was like on the brink of suicide, like that would change your dealing with it. But that's not how it actually plays out, you know?
Mhm.
It's just really sad, man. And it's like obviously the narrator of the story is blaming himself a whole bunch. He's taking this very personally. He's taking this very hard. He feels like it's his fault. Um, and I don't know. I don't like there's no easy answer here, which is what I love about the story. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, I one aspect of it that I was thinking about is the I'm trying to phrase this correctly. So it's like the story of what happened in their childhood, the feeling of it is totally recontextualized by knowing what happened in their adulthood.
yeah, because it's basically her suicide is basically a sort of recreation of that moment.
Yeah. And that's interesting, and I guess like a sad remark on the way that we kind of live our lives as
Sure.
people, because like you can imagine that he lived his whole life up until that moment thinking like, I was a good brother, I saved my sister from what would have been a horrible fall, maybe
Yeah.
her death.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly that moral of the story is inverted and stolen and destroyed
Yeah.
because no, actually, you saved her life, but you dropped the ball. You just, time passed, and then later on you dropped the ball.
Yeah, no, I like this because her letter to him is I've been thinking a lot about it lately, and what I've decided is it would have been better for me if the last rung had broken before you could put the hay down.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're right. There's a certain feeling that I think this character has is that like I saved my sister's life. Look at this thing I did. I saved her life.
Mm-hmm.
Like he never says, "Aren't I awesome?" But he's like, "That was my duty as a brother, and I did my duty." And I think she is kind of telling him, "Actually, you didn't. Actually, when I look at this event now, all I see is it would have been better for me if you hadn't done that." And I think that does really throw him for a loop. And I think that does kind of demonstrate this idea that the things you owe to the loved ones in your life, one moment of heroism doesn't release you from your obligation as a family member, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't like, again, I don't want to seem like this is like phrasing it like that is heading towards blaming him for what happened to his sister, which I don't think is fair. But it is really interesting. Like it is kind of a rumination on what do you owe those people, what responsibilities do you have, and he positioned himself as her protector, and she lived her life that way. I think that's a really interesting thing, is because of this event, she lived her life knowing, or thinking at least, that he would be there, that no matter what happens, he's my big brother, and he would take care of me. It's like, it doesn't matter how bad it gets, he would be there to take care of me. And ultimately he wasn't. Ultimately she took a swine dive off of a building, and there was no hay mow underneath her, and there was no brother to move hay to break her fall. He
Mm-hmm.
wasn't there.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's basically the way that the story is. So it's this terrible, tragic sort of pairing of a almost like a beautiful heroic moment with its sort of horrible inverted nightmare mirror image, and in doing so, sort of robbing that original heroic moment of its savor.
Yeah, that's a really good way of framing it, because it's this idea that like in a different story, that moment would be the end of the story, right? Is like, you did the heroic thing, like you realized the problem immediately. You didn't panic. You immediately went to solve it and you saved her life. And then you have this beautiful moment where she says, oh yeah, I didn't even know what you were doing, but I trusted that you would be there and you would save my life. And oh, we're happy brother and sister and our bond is wonderful. And isn't this great? Isn't this a great rumination on siblings and life and all this stuff? And the king goes, no. Actually, fuck you.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm going to take all this good feeling away from you. Because neither of these characters ends up okay, actually.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's not my favorite kind of story, and I don't say that to be critical of the story. It's just like it leaves me feeling like, oh,
yeah,
that sucks, and I don't know. Again, I'm not criticizing the story at all. It's clever. It's clever in how it does it because of the symmetry of it and the I mean, it really does work perfectly. The idea that she says, I couldn't see what you were doing, but I trusted you. And it's like when they grow up, she can't see what he's doing. And she keeps writing him letters almost as if saying like, hey, are you, what are you doing? Are you assembling?
Down there moving the hay? Just
yeah,
let
are you
me
down
know.
there?
Yeah.
Oh, you're just not. You're just doing your own thing. You've totally forgotten about me. So
yeah.
And also like another part of it that's sad is just the idea of like, she just has a really rough, crappy life. And the story is almost like agnostic as to whether it's her fault or not. Like it doesn't matter. Like as far as the story is concerned, it doesn't matter. It's just like she had a rough life. She had a rough life, and she's miserable. And she has tried hard to make things work, and they have repeatedly not worked. And she is at the end of her rope.
And he, by comparison, has had what you would call a very traditionally successful life. He's a high-powered attorney, very successful. His love life isn't great, right? Am I confusing stories?
I don't remember him having a love life at all, actually. So
I thought he was divorced. I thought they said he was divorced.
I don't remember,
but I might be confusing this story and the last story. I think he's divorced.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure. Don't recall.
Yeah, because it's talking about like how he would the type of letter you get from your sister like this is this thing that you only share with like really close loved ones, and he has like no one to share it with at all. And the tragedy and sadness in that. But I mean, I it's such a I think you're right that it's just like you leave the story like, I don't know, it's a type of story that you leave just like with it kind of turning over in your head for me over and over again. Like it doesn't say anything necessarily profound, but it does say something, or it does at least leave you with impact, I think.
And specifically we spent most of this conversation talking about like the sibling relationship, and it does kind of make you think like, I should call my brother,
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So that's something more than just like a bad feeling.
Yeah.
It's like, how many people did this story motivate to actually call their sibling?
I also want to point out just generally the way, and we talked about this before, but the way King manages to understand childhood in a way that I'm constantly surprised of, because the way the writing kind of shows them climbing up this 70-foot ladder and then just jumping off of a beam into a 20-foot pile of hay, like that's only the crazy shit that a kid would do. And just not even think like I think our narrator gets a little more nervous about it than his sister, and I think that's one of the big differences between them. I think it says that like she always believed that the hay would be there, and he always kind of doubted it, and so he could never swan dive like she could. But I don't know. I just the way that it's written and it's depicted, that this climb up the ladder and this inching along this beam and this like I remember as a kid we used to do stupid shit all the time. Like we had a game when I was a kid where the house I grew up in had a second floor, but the stairs had like the from the bottom floor there were two sets of stairs going up to a landing in the middle, and then another set going all the way up. So two sets meeting in the middle and then continuing up to the second floor. And we would jump off the top of the second floor, like a running jump from my bedroom, leap out onto the landing, which was very far down, like very far down. And we would just do that all the time and not really even think about the consequences of that, or if we would get hurt or anything like that. And it's just,
Yeah.
he just knows what being a kid is like. He really does.
Yep. I mean, I was part of situations like that where kids did get hurt, right? I remember. No, I don't want to tell that story. It's too painful. But yeah, there's like, yeah, people getting hurt moderately badly, and then you're like, oh yeah, obviously that would happen.
Yeah.
but yeah, I totally agree with you. That's it's like King's kid characters are always his most like pure heroic characters too, because they're most in touch with their fear, and yet they do it anyway. Whereas his adult characters can like intellectualize their fear more.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I agree. It's great.
Anything else you want to say about Last Rung on the Ladder?
No. Yeah, I kind of agree with you. This might be one of the ones that sticks with me the most.
Definitely one of my favorites for so many different reasons too. I don't know. Like when we look back on this whole collection, we're gonna have to like talk about why the ones that are gonna remain with us are that way. And I don't even necessarily know the answer yet.
It's a good idea.
All right, so we'll move on to our third story of the week, The Man Who Loved Flowers. This was originally published in the August 1977 issue of Gallery magazine, which that is a porno mag, Matt. Definitely. I know because I looked it up and yep.
Please don't send Scott any more pictures to prove. Oh my god.
This is one that apparently just like totally ripped off Playboy, and like they made their front cover look exactly like Playboy and used the same font. And Hugh Hefner was like, don't do that. And so they changed. But it's a
interesting
wild time in the 70s with all these porn magazines.
Yeah. Amazing.
So this is an interesting story, Matt. And I think it's here that maybe we can kind of attempt to classify the different types of Stephen King short stories, because I think there's ones that are actually just what you would think of and call like a classic short story. You know, there's characters, there's an arc, there's conflict resolution, there's, you know, a story just in miniature form. I think Children of the Corn, great example of that. And then there are ones like The Last Rung on the Ladder, which are just like meditations on vibes, moods, and themes with some characters kind of thrown in to help facilitate it. And then there's stuff like The Man Who Loved Flowers, which is 6 pages long and is basically just a kernel of an idea that's thrown out onto some paper, and that's really all it is. That's it. I want to compare this to The Lawnmower Man, not in tone, but just in, I just have this one little idea, and it's really not much of anything, but I'm gonna throw it out there, and that's it.
Yeah, right. I mean, as a premise, very, very succinctly, just there's a man who everybody's reacting to strongly because he seems to be in love, but then it turns out he's a murderer. That's the most interesting part of it, though, is the beginning. So like my reaction to this book or this story was very extreme. And you might be surprised and make fun of me about this, and it might be kind of silly, but like I knew that there was going to be something that was horribly wrong, or there was going to be some kind of twist, or like this wasn't just going to be a story about a man happily going down the street. And it like something in the way it's written is building this sense of dread, but I had no idea what it was going to be, right? So I was like, okay, is the guy going to get hit by a car suddenly? What are we doing? And I was really getting stressed out. Like I was getting more tense and anxious as the story progressed than I have from many of the other stories in this collection. And it was actually a huge relief when it finally clicked and I realized, you know, what, oh, okay, he's a murderer. Thank God he's a murderer. Okay, I can relax now, you know. I don't know if any of that surprises you, but
I think I'm not going to make fun of you for that at all. I think that's exactly what King is doing here. I think he's laying on some of this stuff so thick, you know, like there's so much picturesque imagery and just happy people. Like, listen to this. The radio poured out bad news that no one listened to. A hammer murderer was still on the loose. That's a little it's a little kernel for you there that you don't really think of. J.F. Clay had declared that the situation in a little Asian country called Vietnam, the guy reading the news had called it, would bear watching. An unidentified woman had been pulled from the East River. A grand jury had failed to indict a crime overlord in the current city administration's war on heroin. The Russians had exploded a nuclear device. None of it seemed real. None of it seemed to matter. The air was soft and sweet. Two men with beer bellies stood outside a bakery pitching nickels and ribbing each other. Spring trembled on the edge of summer, and in the city, summer is the season of dreams. So yeah, that's exactly what you're talking about. There's ominousness in the background. It's there. It's hovering over everything. But the language of the book is so happy, so perfect, so picturesque. There's, married couples seeing how happy this guy is and saying, why don't you look at me like that? There's a man like instructing this kid on how to, like, what are the proper flowers to buy. There's someone else saying, hey, if you need a wedding ring, let me know. Like, it's just this almost overdoing it sense of perfection and serenity, and it leaves you with this really, really weird feeling. And we talked, I think, with I Know What You Need, about how perhaps getting to read that story back in the 70s in Cosmopolitan magazine without knowing who Stephen King was would perhaps enhance your enjoyment of the story, because you would kind of be surprised by the unexpected nature of this. This is a story that I think the exact opposite of. This is a story that reading the story in this collection, you knowing who Stephen King is and knowing the type of author he is, enhances the story, allows that tension build and that uncomfortable air of the tone of the story to work better on you. And I think it's great. It's really great, actually.
Yeah. It's interesting also, like everything you just said, 100% true. And obviously it had the effect on me that I just described, but also I think as a depiction of just like a delightful walk through a city on a nice day, it also is very solid writing.
Yeah, it can work on that level completely. Yeah.
It was vividly making me think about like a specific day where I was on vacation in another country and I was walking through one of these old European cities, and like the absolute sort of vibe of like, nothing bad can possibly be happening anywhere in the world right now because I'm in such a good mood and this is such a beautiful place. That was what it reminded me of. But like in parallel with that, I was also like, but I know something horrible is going to happen. So, and that aspect of it kind of took over more and more as we went on, especially as it begins to get dark. In the story, I was like, okay, now I'm no longer enjoying my joyful walk through the European city and my memories. Sure. I'm like waiting for the thing to happen, whatever it's going to be.
Well, I think there is something relatable about new love that I think really is pulling at you here. You like the idea of like you're having feelings for a person, for new feelings for the first time ever, and you're like sitting there like going to bring them candy and flowers and things like that. And there's something, exciting and new and alive about that feeling. And I just the story, like, this is King at what he does best at times, is just knowing the tone and knowing the audience reaction. Like, he has this remarkable ability to just say, I know this is going to stress you out. I know this is going to, what reading this is going to do for you. I know all these things, and I'm going to use them to pull you along in this very, very short, but also kind of horrifyingly tense story.
Yeah. No, it's actually, it's very different from the other stories and from really anything that I've read of his, in that specific way where he's doing this really specific thing.
Yeah. And of course, the real reveal at the end is that he is a serial killer who is calling every woman he sees Norma and then beating them to death with a hammer when he finds out they're not Norma. I really do like this moment here. With the way King writes this, then he saw her coming towards him from the courtyard, wearing dark blue slacks and a sailor blouse that made his heart ache. It was always a surprise seeing her for the first time. It was always a sweet shock. She looked so young. And like, that's a beautifully written sentence, but there's moments in there that, if you think about it, make you go, wait, what?
Yeah.
What do you mean it was always a surprise seeing her for the first time? What does that sentence mean?
Yeah, and just the context of it is like it doesn't say like he arrived at his destination or anything like that. It's just like he's found some woman.
Yeah.
No, I agree. I love how it's very much like I mean it is third person, but it's written close third person in a way where you're sort of in his frame of madness where he's not at all thinking about like I'm on the prowl.
Yeah.
Find a woman to murder. It's like I'm going to see Norma. I'm going to see Norma. And then when like once again the horrible realization, I guess, that Norma is dead or gone or whatever hits him, it's like too much, and he can't handle it. And
yeah. And I really like this moment where this woman that he's about to murder looks up and smiles at him. But as they drew together, the smile faded, and that's when you're like, he's got you, right? You're like, whoa, what? And then it just rolls out from there, and he just brutally murders this woman, and that's where the story ends.
Yeah. A hammer murderer is a
rough shit.
Yeah. Yep.
All right, Matt. Anything else you wanted to say about the man who loved flowers?
Nope.
Okay, let's move on to our final story of the week and our final story of Night Shift, The Woman in the Room. This story was not previously published before either, and oh boy, this is going to be a tough one to talk about, I think, for us. Incredibly sad, incredibly emotional story. Again, we're not going to do our traditional beat by beat analysis. We're just going to talk about it more holistically. And so just generally the story of a man whose mother is dying of uterine cancer, and him debating on whether or not he wants to release her from her pain by feeding her pain pills until she dies. And this is another one of those ones that feels incredibly personal for Stephen King. We should note here that in 1973, King's mother died of cancer. I don't know when this story was written because it wasn't published before, so we don't have any information on when he actually sat down and wrote this story, if he wrote it specifically for this collection, or what I believe is that this was just part of how he processed the grief of losing his mother. Was sitting down to write this, or perhaps how he processed the pain of watching his mother waste away from this horrible disease.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many details in this story. Once again, this is one. It's weird that we're getting so many of these kind of rapid fire at the end of the anthology, but this feels different from almost anything I can ever think coming from him, and a large part of that is there's this there's this focus on the tactile, auditory, visual details that are surrounding this character. It's really more than anything else. That's what it is. It's this like character whose mind is sort of numbed by the overwhelming stress and a kind of horror, but not the same kind of horror that we're usually talking about. Just overwhelming his mind, and so he's just tuned into the appearance of these, old people walking in their gowns through the hallways, and the sounds on the radio, and the
paint on the walls.
And that's the thing that makes me suspect that it's autobiographical. Is it really sounds like he's. I mean, honestly, I've never been in this situation, but I've been in somewhat similar situations, and it's like sometimes you just need to get those details out of your head. Otherwise, they're just going to keep playing on a loop,
Yeah, I mean, I think we're both very fortunate that we both have two living parents still. And but I think we've both lost grandparents.
Right.
And I'm very lucky that I don't think I've never had to lose someone to cancer. I did. My grandmother died of Parkinson's, and that is a just horribly cruel disease that is very, very difficult watching someone slowly die to that. It's truly awful. And that's like one of the things I find so relatable and touching and devastating about the story is that, we have this character whose his central act here is I'm debating whether or not I want to release my mother from her suffering, whether I want to do this thing. And I think, I'm not saying that I think like King assisted his mother in suicide, and that's he's admitting to it here or whatever. But I do think if you're a person that's struggling with watching your loved one suffer, especially a loved one like a parent, I can't imagine. Um, there is part of that frustration and the horror of it for you is that you are kind of powerless to do anything for them, right? Like you can't fix them. You can't help. Like you can help them, you can visit them, but they're still going to be in pain. They're still going to be wasting away. They're still going to be dying, and there's nothing you can do. So this idea of it, if this is truly entirely fictional, which I think it is King inventing a situation in which he can give a character that is a stand-in for him some agency in this process. Like I can do something for my suffering mother, something. I find really, really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean it's the only real concession that he makes toward making it an actual story instead of just sort of a tone poem of autobiographical tragedy. Because he is, the plot is that he's struggling with this idea of, am I going to go through with this? Am I going to have the courage to do this? Does she really want me to do this? Is the right thing? Is it the right thing to do? If I do it, am I going to get caught? And is it worth it to do it anyway, even if I might get caught?
Mm-hmm.
All of this tension bubbling through him. One thing maybe I should have mentioned earlier is like it's written in a very strange way because there's this snapping back and forth between moments in time,
mid sentence snapping,
and sometimes there's a sort of bit of conceptual connective tissue, but sometimes there's barely that, and it's just I think it really is incredibly good at conveying this feeling of like tumult and tension, and just like the unrelenting nature of the tension, where it's like we're moving through time, we're moving through space, but like at no point is there a reprieve from the knowledge that his mom is suffering horribly, and there's like nothing he can do about it. If he goes and sees her, he feels bad because he has to see her suffering. But if he's not watching her suffering, he still knows she's suffering. So it's not like it's any better. And then when he finally does it, the text distinctly says he didn't feel any better or worse. I was like, oh my God. Like it's just so like honest and raw. And I don't even like to call it sad. It feels inadequate. It's staring at one of those things where you never want to have to think about it, and sort of forcing you to think about it. It's almost,
and yet we're kind of all going to have to, or not all of us, but most people are going to have to deal with this very thing. If not cancer, then something else. Our parents are going to die. It's going to happen, and we're going to have to deal with that.
And if not our parents, someone close to you at some point. In a way where it's really gonna hurt. So. Yeah, it's just the unrelentingness of it, right? Is there's not a crack of sunshine in this story.
I'm actually I'm both glad that you got to read this and not listen to it, and also a bit disappointed because I do wonder that stylistic thing you were just talking about. I do wonder how that functions in an audio format. You know, if it's easier or harder to tell what King is doing with that like mid-sentence cut to a completely different scene and sequence, but is connected by the words in the sentence that has its cut in half. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine it being confusing, but I also imagine that they would do something to kind of help you figure out what was going on.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, I think, I was thinking to myself as I read the story, I was like, why did The Last Rung on the Ladder fuck me up so much? And that is the story that I took away from this thing and thought about over and over again. And this one wasn't. And the conclusion I came to actually was that I think it was just the time of my life I was in when I read these two stories. And that story affected me more. This story didn't affect me as personally because I was living in my comfy bubble of, I don't have to worry about my parents dying. That's not a thing that I need to think about at all.
Yeah.
And reading it again here, I'm approaching middle age very quickly. My parents are getting older. And I think I was talking to you about this earlier. I think having children puts this whole thing in a context that I have never had before, which is like the other day I was thinking about like, oh, well, my son's going to graduate high school in 16 years and I'll be in my 50s by then. And then going, oh, my parents will be 82. That's old.
Yeah.
That's the age of maybe they'll be 82, or maybe they won't be around anymore. And I don't know, like I don't forecast into the future that much, or I didn't before having children. And suddenly I'm thinking about these things more, and so I'm thinking about the very quickly approaching moments in my life in which things like this are things I'm going to have to deal with. And I'm definitely not ready for it at all.
Yeah, I don't know that I could possibly be ready for it.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
But yeah, no, I agree with everything you just said. You know, there sometimes you're you know, as they get older, your parents will have medical problems, and it's just like, you know, maybe 10 or 20 years ago, if one of my parents had a medical issue, it was just like, oh yeah, people have medical issues. But now it all seems to me to be some harbinger of something, and I'm just like causes me anxiety every time, which you know, is true, but at the same time, you don't necessarily want to like tell them that, because you want them to like know that they can tell you these things.
Yeah.
So it's and they want to shield you from it. You know, it's hard.
This was definitely a call my mom after reading it story. You know, you said call your siblings after reading it with the last one, but this is definitely called my mom right up and just be like, hey, just want you to know I love you. I think that is, to me, one of the most fascinating aspects of the story, actually, is, you know, you look at the title, The Woman in the Room, right? It's not my mother in the room.
Yeah.
It's not
my mother's death, you know.
Yeah. It's the woman in the room. And that's one thing that the story does very distinctly, is it kind of divides the narrator's experience with this woman in half. The time where she was his mother and the time she's this other woman. Like I love the writing here. His most vivid memory of her in the life he lived as her son is of a time when he was 12. He and his brother Kevin and this woman had moved to Maine so that she could take care of her parents. You know, there's this clear divide of that this is a woman that like it is his mother and it looks like his mother, but like there's this distinct difference between this woman who was everything in your life, the god of your life, when you were younger, and seeing this person kind of laid low in a bed wasting away. And I think that is, you know, thank God it's not something I've had to experience yet, but I think that is something very specific to the death of a parent, of, you know, biological or otherwise. This is a person that, you know, that either created you or raised you, or like just the experience of moving from, you know, your parent being your entire world to your parent being just a part of your life as an adult to, oh, your parent being a frail old person that is going to die. It's weird. I don't like it. I don't like it.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on something, you know, that bit you just read, because the vivid memory that he has is such a fascinating, you know, authorial choice to include this, because it continues this thread of like unrelenting kind of sorrow and sort of an ambiguous look at the complicated nature of love, because it's not like we get to retreat into the past and have a warm memory of her cooking him ratatouille after he skinned his knee. It's like, no, it's a time where she was obviously, you know, from context, we infer she was obviously frazzled and stressed out of her mind by the fact that she has to take care of her own dying parent. And she basically beats him up with a wet grandmother diaper.
Yeah.
Because he smarted off. And this is not portrayed as, you know, I was still angry with her about that, nor is it portrayed as I forgive her. It was just, that was a thing that happened. That was a memory that jumped out to me.
The most vivid memory. Yeah.
The most vivid memory and he's still being this perfectly dutiful son while he's thinking like, Oh yeah, that time she beat the crap out of me with a wet diaper, and I was like so ashamed that I barely talked for years.
Yeah.
And it's, again, it's like that ambiguity, and that there, it's just I think yeah, I think what I'm trying to say is that the story just so thoroughly refuses to be sentimental about the
Yeah.
idea of losing your parent, and like it refuses to give you any tiny edge of like, but it's all okay because we'll see each other again. And it's like, no, this is the moment. We're trapped inside this moment
Yeah.
where this is actually happening right now.
Mm-hmm. You can't run from it. You can't hide in your past. You can't hide in warm fuzzy memories of this vibrant, young, beautiful woman that was your mother. No.
Yeah.
There's no escaping this. Yeah.
Yeah. And in some sense, maybe you don't want to escape it, or you shouldn't escape it. Yeah.
I wanted to read this part as well because I just find this really interesting. Perhaps it is his fault anyway. He is the only child to have been nurtured inside her, a change of life baby. His brother was adopted when another smiling doctor told her she would never have any children of her own. And of course, the cancer now in her began in the womb like a second child, his own darker twin. His life and her death began in the same place. Should he not do what the other is doing already, so slowly and clumsily? I just found that really affecting, this idea of his life and her death began in the same place. That this is, just a powerful image of, his manifestation of responsibility for this in some way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, feeling some guilt, even though it has absolutely nothing to do with him.
Yeah.
Maybe. So do you think there's meant to be ambiguity as to whether she understands what's happening at the end, or do you think it's pretty clear that she does?
To me, it was clear that she does, and she wants it, and she's fine with it.
Yeah, I think that's how I felt as well. I just wondered if you had a different impression.
No, yeah, I think to me that was pretty clear.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I want to get into the whole conversation about like assisted, like right to die and that kind of stuff. I think there's many different opinions on many different aspects of this. I do think it seems to me in a case like this, that there is something sympathetic about letting this woman go in this way rather than sit here and waste for however long it was going to take her.
Yeah. I agree that I don't want to get into the weeds there. I mean, it's the kind of thing where it's like there's a humane argument, and then there's like trying to construct a sensible policy.
Sure. Yeah. No, those are two entirely different covers. Yeah.
There's almost like an impossible clash between the two, where it's like you can't really institute a policy for the nuances and ambiguities of human suffering and choice and so forth.
I thought the chordotomy was kind of like horribly appalling in a lot of ways. Like I understand, like it's a do they do those still?
I don't know. I have no idea. It seems like the kind of thing you only do if the person is terminal anyway. Is that the idea?
Basically it's just like you are suffering so much, so we're literally just gonna cut the pain receptors out of your brain, and there you won't hurt as much. Yeah, which is interesting. Like that's one of the things I really like about the writing in this, is because there's, he's talking to the doctor about like, will she ever walk again? And the doctor, like I think King puts a lot of subtext in the doctor's responses to this, where he's like, so she's gonna just be bedridden for the rest of her life, and the doctor like pauses and is like, yeah. And the unspoken words there is like, well, yes, but that's not a long amount of time. We're not talking months here. We're talking days.
Yeah. Right.
I think just like the way King has the characters like fill in those moments between the dialogue, I think is really fantastic.
Yeah, I guess that's one thing about the story I did want to hit on is the presence of the doctors in the story and the way the doctors are treated, and that this also feels somewhat autobiographical, and just like the simultaneous sort of like disgust and admiration, almost, just or the two things oscillating, where it's like couldn't you have done something better for her than this, while at the same time appreciating that the answer is like, no, they couldn't have. It's extremely aggressive cancer. I mean, the only other thing I'll say about that and the whole, end of life care thing is, like, my understanding is that when doctors find out that they have some inoperable cancer, they don't go to the hospital. They just go home and they say, all right, I'm going to just live the rest of my life, and then I'm going to be dead soon because the cancer is going to kill me. But they don't try to fight it.
That's fascinating.
And I'm not saying that's like a statistical 100% regularity, but
sure.
The tendency is that they have seen the way people die when they go into, long-term treatment for their terminal cancers, and they tend to just say, I know where that goes. I know what that looks like. I'm going to opt out. Most people don't get to see that, or get to see that. Most people don't see that. They don't know what they're getting into when they go in for treatment.
No, you're totally right. Yeah. Ugh.
Yeah.
I hope I never have to deal with
this. Yeah, me too.
Ugh. I don't know. It's a powerful story. I think obviously it's an incredibly personal story for him. I wonder if there was any kind of hesitation of putting in this collection, because it does feel like something he wrote specifically for himself.
Yeah, maybe
to just help process that stuff he was going through.
I was going to say it seems really interesting and important that he put it at the end of the collection, and we'll probably talk more about that next week when we sort of look at the whole collection. But in terms of, I think Stephen King knows the effect that putting. He knows that you're going to remember something at the end more than you're going to remember something buried in the middle somewhere.
Yeah, no, I think you're right.
And so maybe he was conflicted. I don't know, but he did ultimately choose to put it at the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh gosh. Well, sorry for the tenor of this week's conversation. This is the remarkable thing about short stories: is for half an hour we talked about corn demons and if Stephen King wants to have sex with a cob of corn, and then we finish up with this, which is this intensely sad meditation on losing a parent, which I just.
That's a good point, and after this week, we're not going to be doing this anymore.
No,
I did enjoy this. Again, we'll talk more about that next week, I guess. But it was actually harder. I guess I'll just say that right now. This is a lot harder to do than our normal thing.
I agree.
For a variety of reasons.
I agree. It has value for sure. I enjoyed it for sure. I will say, I'm kind of predicating a conversation we're going to have next week, but I will say that I'm kind of glad I picked a shorter short story collection for this. Like one of the things I was debating, Skeleton Crew, Nightmares and Dreamscapes, which are much, 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 much bigger short story collections that would have had us in that realm for months instead of month. And I'm kind of glad we went this way.
Makes sense.
Yeah. All right. Well, that will do it for Night Shift. As we said, we'll be back next week to have our overview episode where we will talk about all the stories and maybe what we learned and all that fun stuff.
Sounds good.
But let's get on to the discussion question of the week, Matt. Last week, we asked our listeners, I lost it. Where is it? There we go. Ed knows what Liz needs, but not really. And we asked listeners, what is your favorite instance of characters with conflicting wants and needs? What did the algorithm pick for us this month, Matt?
Well, so I think this question got fewer direct answers. So the algorithm struggled, and I had to do some going in and picking things myself, simply because I don't think there were enough to fill out the entire docket. Sorry if I just missed something. I did not. I did my best.
Well, now you've just taken all the blame yourself for this.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's like, what's the point of having the algorithm if you're going to have to go in by yourself, right? But anyway. All right. So Steve Living Room says, doesn't every character in every book have different wants than needs in varying degrees? But my answer would have to be Harold Lauder. He wanted to hate everyone, feel superior, and have continued reasons for his hate, but he needed connection with the good group. Tragic. Yeah.
Look,
I would say that he is a particularly clear and vivid example of this.
I agree. Great answer.
Yeah.
Next, we have Pear Jane, who says Disney's 2009 animated feature, The Princess and the Frog, certainly features the refrain, "You got what you wanted, but you lost what you need." The setting is in 1930s New Orleans, and the titular characters are, respectively, a young woman who's worked herself to the bone to open her own restaurant, and a prince who wants to marry a rich woman so he can continue living the high life. A Baron Samedi character, Keith David, turns Prince Naveen into a frog for his shallow ways, and when Naveen the frog kisses Tiana the woman, the spell backfires and they both become frogs, forced to find their way back to New Orleans in a time for him to kiss the Mardi Gras princess. Being Disney, of course, they befriend a trumpet playing alligator and a wise firefly and sing some banger jazz tunes. And of course, when they seek help from the voodoo woman living on the boat in a tree in the middle of the swamp, she tries to get them to see what they need. True love, of course, and the gospel style dig a little deeper kills. It's a classic big production number featuring a gospel choir of flamingos. That's great. I've actually never seen The Princess and the Frog.
Yeah, I've seen it a couple of times.
You have kids that would watch that, so
yeah, that was why. And I liked it. And yeah, it has great music. I like the villain a lot. It has a really great. I'm famously really annoyed that Disney kind of nerfed their villains and they stopped having really like great scary villains. But he's like a voodoo. He like the villain is like a voodoo sorcerer who like controls evil spirits and stuff. So there's a lot of like cool like darkness imagery.
Mm-hmm.
It's very very good classic Disney villain.
Great.
Next answer is from Tin Bugdock. I absolutely love the entirety of the Seinfeld series, and my favorite part about the characters is how their wants constantly sabotage their needs, whether it be a good job, a good relationship, or anything of value. Jerry, George, and Elaine are constantly beset with self-inflicted wounds. Only Kramer, who is seemingly too dumb to have wants, gets everything that he needs without ever seeming to exert any real effort in the process. The futility of the other three face in every endeavor stands in stark contrast to his carefree wins in most of the series. I love that. That's so perfect because yeah, I mean, I and also like separating Kramer from the others, I think is very smart because I don't know that I've ever actually had that thought consciously or realized that like Kramer is not like the other three. The other three are idiots who it's always their fault that they end up failing and miserable.
Yeah. Real account name here says, my answer to the discussion question would be the narrator from Fight Club. When the story begins, the narrator is consumed by what he wants. Safety, IKEA furniture, and all the trappings of his dreadful modern life. But when Tyler introduces himself, the narrator starts discovering that what he wanted all along was not what he needed. What he was lacking was fulfillment, purpose, drive, a sense of being alive in a way that his IKEA life wasn't giving him. That's true. But also, isn't the story kind of saying that Tyler's stuff is bullshit too?
I think
we could get into a big Fight Club discussion here.
Yeah, I mean, I think what he needed was human connection, really more than. I mean, sure. I think he did need all those things, but I think the foremost thing that he needed was human connection. Mm-hmm. And but he was terrified of it. And when Marla Singer offers him human connection, real human connection, not the fake human connection like he was getting in the support groups, he is terrified, runs away, rejects it. But he wants it. He actually subconsciously wants it so desperately that he creates the alter ego to pursue it. Because the alter ego knows what he needs, but the alter ego is also crazy and pursues things in a terribly self-destructive manner. So that's my essay on that.
So from the perspective of the film, because I have not read the book, how do you feel like the ending aligns with that, the wants versus needs thing?
Well, it's clearly the ending is even more clearly about the idea that the human connections that he made were what actually mattered, and all of the other crazy stuff that he was doing was indeed crazy and bad for him.
Sure.
It's less clear even what he wants from the book, though, because it's so disjointed intentionally. All right, next, Baby Can You Dig Your Sam says Larry Underwood. He wants to run away, to not be responsible, but he needs to lead, to mature, and to stand.
Oh, that's a good answer. I like that.
Yeah, it's perfect. Well said.
E-Man9000 says, my answer for this week's discussion question is Guts from the manga Berserk, written by the late Kentaro Miura. Matt, why do I always have to read the anime ones? How does this always happen?
The algorithm.
But it's not this time. You said specifically.
Well, I didn't order them carefully in order to make sure that you were going second.
I don't believe you. Berserk and the Dark Tower have a shocking amount of similarities, with the most notable being that they follow an insanely badass protagonist whose central conflict is needing to learn learning to value his loved ones more than his quest. The manga follows the black swordsman Guts on his quest to kill an evil otherworldly being named Femto. We later learn that his quest for vengeance started when Femto sacrificed hundreds of Guts' comrades and sexually assaulted his one true love, Casca, in front of him, the trauma which left her physically broken. The story goes on for a couple hundred issues of manga, and Guts ends up traveling with the now mentally broken Casca and a team of comrades he gathered along the way. The wants versus need moment comes after an epic end-of-story arc boss battle that leaves our hero broken and exhausted. He looks into the distance and sees Femto. Over a decade of storytelling has led to this possible clash of swords. Rather than leap into battle and risk the life of his comrades, Guts just closes his eyes and rests. The series changes dramatically after this moment because Guts' new goal for the rest of the story is about finding a way to heal Casca's psyche rather than pursue his quest for vengeance. Berserk and the Dark Tower touch on a lot of the same notes thematically, and this moment has always been so wonderful for me because it shows what a world where Roland truly learned the value of his content more than the tower could look like. All right, so I was a little nervous when I started reading about manga, but you came around on me, E-Man. That was good. I enjoyed that answer.
I've heard really good things about Berserk in terms of like actually being a literary story, the likes of which we would appreciate. I haven't read it though, and I think that the writer of it like died young, relatively recently, and people were just totally shocked and heartbroken about this. Which I don't. Yeah, I like the little that I know about it strikes me as being extremely tragic. But I do want to read this someday. There's not really a big space in my life for getting into a giant manga right now, unfortunately. Thanks for the answer, though. I love it. Yeah. We'll consider that this was a different loop. This was a different journey to the tower. Was Guts, and Guts is Roland in this reincarnated, obviously. All right. All 84001 says the best example has got to be none other than old, long, tall, and ugly, the Kala crowd surfer, the OG tower junkie, everyone's favorite matricide, the bane of the Mohane, Mr. Roland Deschain himself.
That was incredible.
Oh my God. It's kind of the central struggle at the core of his character, and his failure to reconcile his wants and needs is why he's ultimately doomed. What Roland wants is to reach the tower and climb to the top. What he needs is to save the tower, restore the beams, and then fuck off to a small homestead with Susanna and Oi to raise some beauty sheep and break his damn loop. Can you give me amen? Can you give me hallelujah?
But he's never going to get it, Matt, because that's how the story works.
Yep. Poor Roland.
Poor Roland.
Poor the bane of the Mohane.
The bane of the Mohane. All right, now next we have Constant Reader 19, who says Bill Murray's character Phil Connors in Groundhog Day is a perfect example of a character who thinks he knows what he wants and comes to find out what he actually needs. In the beginning, he's a lecherous, arrogant prick who dreams of getting out of his job and hitting the big time as an anchor in a larger city. Besides his career aspirations, he wants to get in his producer Rita's pants. Through the never-explained Groundhog Day phenomenon, he gets a chance to live the same day over and over. He spends the first days, years of them it seems, fulfilling every selfish fantasy, all while learning Rita as Ed learned Liz, but she repeatedly sniffs him out and hilariously rejects him with many slaps. It's only after Phil realizes that his existence is empty and kills himself in many clever and equally hilarious ways that he tries out a day of selflessness. Like Lightning McQueen, he helps everyone out in town, not only becoming a legend in one day, but finding a fulfillment that he's never experienced before. In the end, we tastefully find out that he will soon be in Rita's pants the right way, and that all his selfish dreams have melted like the Groundhog Day snow, as he and Rita decide to live in Punxsutawney.
Yeah, exactly.
I like the random Lightning McQueen reference thrown in. That was pretty great.
Yeah, I know. I was like, yeah, that's a good reference. Makes sense. Agree.
It does make sense.
Yeah.
Good. Cars is just a Groundhog Day story, but with cars.
Sort of, yeah. So sort of. Great answers, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That does it for last week's discussion question, or I guess is it this week's? I don't know. Normally in our overview episode, we just do a mailbag. But since we only spent a month with Night Shift and we just did a mailbag 4 weeks ago, we're not going to do that this time. So instead, we're going to ask you guys another question, and it's going to be just about Night Shift specifically. We want to know, as we talk about this short story collection as a whole and what our favorite stories were and what we liked most about it, we want to know what your favorite short story in Night Shift is and why. We've talked about all of them. We want to hear from you. Which one did you like the most and why?
Yeah, I can't wait to hear everybody's thoughts, because I haven't even really thought about this much yet, so I don't have a favorite yet. Yeah,
it changed like 6 times over the course of this journey through the book, so I don't even know. We'll figure it out.
All right, cool.
All right, that's going to do it for us here this week on Kingslingers. As we said, next week is our overview episode on Night Shift. And then after that, we are starting our new book. We are heading into Richard Bachman and The Long Walk in just a couple weeks. So get that book ordered and get ready to walk a whole lot.
Yeah. It sounds really like a good exercise book or something.
Sure, Matt.
Yeah. Remember, you can reach us via email at kingslingerspod@gmail.com, over on Twitter at kingslingerspod, and over on the subreddit at r/doofmedia.
If you are not already subscribed to Kingslingers, now is the time to do it. You don't want to miss The Long Walk. It's going to be a really great conversation. We'll be returning to form to our normal format and everything with deep dives into novels. So don't miss it. Subscribe now. We're everywhere, everywhere. If you've listened to this far, maybe we should move this part, because if you've listened this far into the episode and you are not subscribed, that's just kind of weird.
It is. We probably could stand to move around our intro and outro after several years.
Several years
wouldn't be a bad idea.
Yeah. All right, we'll talk about that later. But subscribe so you don't miss when we move the intro and outros around.
In any case, if you like any of our shows and you want to support us, then please consider donating to our Patreon account at patreon.com/doofmedia. Special thanks this week to our new patrons, Adam F., Susan, Debbie M., and Jess S. Welcome. We hope you enjoy the stuff we have over there on the Patreon. We're going to have some new bonus podcasts rolling out this coming week or two, or just
you've got your
really.
Show with your brother. Speaking of siblings and sibling relationships, you've got your show with your brother coming out next week.
Yeah, we're releasing that next week. Which, by the way, is a great hack if you need an excuse to stay in contact with your sibling.
Start a podcast.
Start a podcast. No joke.
I mean, that's what the McElroys did, literally.
Yeah.
And now they have a podcasting empire.
That's what you do, man.
Why isn't our podcast an empire yet?
I mean, it's sort of like a, township. That's what it is.
Doof Media, the township of podcasts.
Yeah.
I love it. And then a week after that, I think Maximum Overdrive, our Other Levels of the Tower episode, will be coming out. So look forward to that as well.
Excited about that.
I am. I certainly am. But of course, if you cannot afford to donate and join us on Patreon, that is absolutely okay. You can continue to help us out by sharing the podcast as we move into The Long Walk. And after that, it would be a great time to bring people aboard and have them join our journey through these novels and through these decades. Now's the time. Share, please, and make sure you're leaving ratings and reviews as well. We haven't had a new review to read in a couple weeks, and we like reading those. So please send those in.
Yeah, we'd appreciate that.
All right, folks, that is it. We are done, and we will be back next week to finish up our conversation about Night Shift. We'll see you then. Long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.